Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Angela Hildyard Leadership Symposium. It's sure to be an incredible morning, and I'm pleased that so many people could join us today. We have some introductory words and some housekeeping things to go through, so I think people will be filtering in over the next couple of minutes. My name is Shannon, and I'm Anishinaabe and Scottish, and I'm a member of Alderville First Nation. I work as the director at the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, and this office has just celebrated our 5th birthday here at U of T. So we're really excited to be here with everyone today to talk about some of the work that's happened and some of the work that is in our future. I look forward to learning and sharing with everyone today. But before we begin, I need to go over a few things that will help our event run a bit smoother. Creating a space accessible to all our attendees is a shared responsibility between everyone in this space. We have endeavored to create an accessible space that eliminates barriers to participation. If there is anything about the sound, the background, or any other aspects of the presentation that we should address, please email people.events@utoronto.ca, and a member of our team will address your concerns. Regarding the use of Zoom, we've decided today to keep the chat function open as we recognize it can be a valuable tool for engagement. We will do our best to monitor the chat throughout the event. Any disrespectful language or comments will result in removal. In the event of a Zoom bombing, the session will immediately close and we will send a follow-up email. If anyone in the audience is having technical issues with Zoom, you should message all panelists using the chat function and someone will support you. If you have a question for our speakers or our panelists throughout the event today, please use the Q&A box to type your question, not the chat feature. And if you do use the chat feature, they'll likely get lost in what we hope to have a lively conversation in the chat as well. Zoom will record the Q&A questions and the Q&A moderators will read selected questions. Please ask your question anonymously if you do not want your name to be read. In order to enable the closed caption, please select the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We understand that the content covered today may provoke strong feelings. Should you feel like you would like to speak to someone, there are support services available through the Employee and Family Assistance Program. Additionally, we have shared the contact information for other supports and resources at the university in the chat. There's also the Hope and Wellness line that offers immediate mental health counseling and crisis intervention to all Indigenous people across Canada. So for today's agenda, I will just go through it relatively quickly. We are going to have a traditional opening today and some other opening remarks. Followed by the opening remarks, we'll have our keynote address with Cynthia Wesley-Eskima, and following that talk, we will have a short break. Returning from the short break, we will have a panel discussion with Susan Hill, Archana Sridhar, and Suzanne Stewart. Both the keynote and the panel will have short question and answer periods to follow them. The event will conclude with a traditional closing. The event will be recorded for archival purposes and may be reused by the co-organizers. The recording is of the on-camera participants only and will only include images of our speakers. No audience members will be shown. However, if you do come off mute to ask a question today, your voice will be recorded. Okay, so everything I promise will be far more interesting moving forward. So we are going to have our traditional opening now with Andrew Wesley. Andrew is an elder in residence at First Nations House. He's a member of the U of T Elders Circle. He's Mushkegowako Cree from James Bay, and he's a big part of the Indigenous community here in Toronto and across the province and beyond. His full bio can be found in the chat, and I'm now going to pass things over to Andrew to do our opening.
It's good to be here this morning to be able to do the opening. I had the sage been burning while we were having our discussion in order to open our mind so that what we hear is going to be good for us individually and for our community. I'll be saying the prayer in the language of my people, the Mashkegu Cree. Eta bian wabanok na naskoman, kauchimini goyak sagioin, mina bego ipagitinagoyak, kuyasimatiak, ogiskanoma given isko na naskoman, umetutagoyak. Eta bian, shawanok na naskoman, kauchimini tutagoyak, kauchimini goyak, mesayo van gamelosh, kuyasiabajastay matiak. Eta biana kapiano na naskoman, ekimetu tagawiak, umaga kinipayak, kaikiano epiak, kuya sekino epiak kauchi, metinintama, kauchi mushuyak, zachakana, estamagioina. Eta bian kiwetino na naskoman kauchi takayak, miajettigishoyak. Na naskoman na maguyas mituninjagan kaimini guyak. Kuyasiabajastaya, Yamituyak, Inagaskatia, Misohoge Gona, Nanaskuma. Great Spirit, our Creator, who gave us life, Mother Earth to honor and to protect. South comes beauty and all our food and medicine. West, we ask that our plants be made clean to us. Teach us patience, kindness, fairness, and courage. North, we are goodwill and honesty in our plans. East, we wake to greet the sun, greatest gift of all. Great Spirit, make us look after our children, the orphans, the lame, and the blind. All these things I beg of you, Great Spirit. Bless all the people that are in this conference. And all this we ask. And ask me out. A good day. Hi, English.
Miigwech, Andrew, for your words this morning and opening up our event in such a beautiful way. It always really helps to set such a nice tone before the other really important work we're going to do today. I would now like to introduce Kelly Hannah Moffitt. Kelly is a professor in criminology and sociology studies and vice president of people strategy, equity, and culture at the University of Toronto. Her portfolio oversees recruitment, organizational and staff development, compensation, benefits, and HR technology and innovation. She oversees a range of safety and equity offices, including the offices of anti-racism and cultural diversity, accessibility and sexual diversity, community safety, high risk, and crisis management. Kelly's full bio will be in the chat, but I will pass things over to Kelly now.
Thank you very much, Shannon, and thank you, Wes and Andrew, and also thank you both very much for your leadership at the university and support of the Office of Indigenous Initiatives. Your work and your commitment to these things have helped you to learn and move forward and understand the great deal of work that we need to continue to do. I'd like to start with our land acknowledgement, and I'm very honored to be able to deliver it today. I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I also wish to acknowledge that as an administrative leader and professor at the University of Toronto, I have a responsibility to drive change and to support truth and reconciliation efforts within our community, especially in the areas of the hiring of Indigenous faculty, librarians, and staff, and supporting the building of cultural competency about Indigenous histories and contemporary lives lived and experiences. I also recognize that my division's work is to foster a culture of belonging at the University of Toronto. It is essential to consider the distinct and often harmful relationship Indigenous peoples have with the Canadian education system and with Canada itself. I wish to acknowledge that the many Indigenous members of the University of Toronto community across all three of our campuses, including those who are participating in our event today, who are creating supportive spaces for Indigenous students and employees, integrating Indigenous ways of knowing into our curriculum, and providing expertise and guidance to the university administration as we answer the 34 calls to action so clearly identified in the University of Toronto's Truth and Reconciliation Steering Committee 5 years ago. I'd also like to take a moment to speak about the origin of today's symposium. Today's event is the third Angela Hildyard Leadership Symposium at the University of Toronto. Its namesake, Angela Hildyard, is a professor at OISE who led the Division of Human Resources and Equity, which is now known as People's Strategy, Equity, and Culture, as vice president for 25 years. And she is also currently the special advisor to the president and the provost. I'm proud to call Angela a trusted advisor, as so many others do in my division and across the university. The origins of this annual symposium lie in Angela's strong commitment to cultivating leaders at the University of Toronto who integrate principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion into their work, model, and also for all others, model inclusive leadership for others. This legacy of Angela's is felt within our division today and within the university. Now more than ever, the university needs leaders who are compassionate, committed to change, and have a real understanding of how many different identities our communities hold and the impact of an individual's work and their experience of work. They also need to understand the importance that wellness plays in their own ability to lead others. At this symposium today, we are fortunate to engage in listening, thinking, and discussion around indigeneity in higher education. I hope that everyone here who leads people at the university, no matter what the size of your team or unit, can take back some valuable insights and a renewed clarity about our individual and collective responsibilities to truth and reconciliation. In 2021, the annual progress report of the Office of Indigenous Initiatives that will soon be published on the Office of Indigenous Initiatives website identifies many areas in which positive change has occurred at the University of Toronto across all three campuses. But it also importantly shows areas that we need to improve and places where we need to do more work and reaffirm our commitments to that work. New Indigenous spaces, both inside and outside, have been completed and conceived. For example, we have expanded the Indigenous representation among our faculty, librarians, and staff. As people leaders, every one of us has the choice and the opportunity to build this momentum in the year ahead, to support initiatives that create more meaningful spaces and systems for Indigenous students and employees at the University of Toronto. The end goal of this work is to ensure that every member of our community is met with respect and compassion, and when they participate in our classrooms, boardrooms, offices, and labs, they feel like they belong. With that, I'd also like to extend my sincere thanks to Cynthia Wesley Eskimo for offering your insights to us in this forum. And thank you to everyone who will be engaging as a panelist, facilitator, or participant. I'm looking forward to learning from all of you this morning and to hearing your words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you so much for your ongoing support of the Office of Indigenous Initiatives and Indigenous U of T. It really means a lot to have your support and guidance through all of the changes and the growth that we're going through right now. I would now like to introduce Jonathan Hamilton Diabo. Jonathan is Mohawk from Ganawage First Nation. He is currently the Special Advisor, Indigenous Initiatives, and is an Assistant Professor at Victoria University in the University of Toronto. He was the former Director at the Office of Indigenous Initiatives, as well as the former Director at First Nations House, the Indigenous Student Services. And his full bio you can also find in the chat. And I will pass things over to Jonathan, who is going to bring us into our keynote address.
Well, thank you, Shannon, and thank you, Kelly and Andrew, for your words. And I'm really happy to be here today and honored to be able to introduce Dr. Cynthia Wesley-Eskema. Cynthia is the chair for the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada for Lakehead University. Prior to that, she served 3 years as the vice provost for the Indigenous Initiatives as well for the institution. She continually works to develop pathways to forward reconciliation within the institution, but also across Canada. She was the founder of the Canadian Roots Exchange, which is an Indigenous-led organization that collaborates with communities to strengthen and amplify the voices of Indigenous youth. As well, Cynthia also was an instructor over at University of Toronto, and I had the great honor of working with Cynthia while I was at First Nations House, and got to see all the fantastic work that she did, and that's kind of where Canadian Roots started from. Cynthia was also inducted as the honorary witness by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in 2014 and chairs the governing circle for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is housed at the University of Manitoba. She sits on various boards across Ontario and is dedicated to social justice work. On a personal note, as mentioned, I have had the opportunity to work with Cynthia, who I met many years ago, where she helped when I was at First Nations House, the staff and I to kind of think about our strategic planning. So she was really an important part of that work. And also I've just had the opportunity just to sit and chat with Cynthia over the years. Got to learn a lot about her and her family and some who I do know as well. And I think this is a little bit more appropriate for me to be introducing Cynthia. A number of years ago, as Cynthia might remember, I was at we were on a panel together at the George Brown College. It was a symposium over there. And I was stunned that I was on a panel with Cynthia. Myself, my other colleague looked at Cynthia, said, "You are the panel. We're just going to be a cheerleader for you." Cynthia is an amazing person. I'm just very honored to be part of this today and be able to introduce her and welcome her to give her talk. So now I'd like to pass it on to Cynthia. Now we'll go.
Now we'll go, Jonathan. Thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you much for the invitation and also the opening for this particular talk. So I want to thank the Elder Wesley for his opening prayer. This is obviously the way to open up everything, and it's something we all do very much across the country. And thank you to the participants for being here and for the invitation to be here for the Andrea Hildyard Leadership Symposium. So I want to start by situating myself, my thoughts, and why I'm here today. So my name, as you've heard, is Cynthia Wesley-Eskema. For those of you still wondering how to pronounce it, they were actually correct. I want to identify myself because it's become increasingly important for all of us to do this. And even though I'm speaking English and not Anishinaabe, and I'm going to go through just to situate who I am. My names come from a variety of places. Cynthia is the name of one of my mother's 11 sisters who died as an infant. I was gifted with her name. In those days, infant mortality was very high. It still is in many Indigenous communities across Canada. And of the 13 children born to my grandmother, only 9 survived to adulthood and only 1 was male. My difficult to pronounce last name comes from my mother's family, the Esquimaux of Sucker Creek, now called Ondek First Nation on Manitoulin Island. They were an Odawa and Potawatomi family living among Ojibwe peoples. And there's, of course, a long story behind this. My grandfather, Stanley Eskima, who died quite young, was Potawatomi. And I still remember telling my mother, I found his name on a Potawatomi enrollment list. My mother, who always had a great sense of humor, said, "Oh, geez, please don't tell me that. I've been Ojibwe for far too long to now be a Potawatomi." So, we had a good laugh about it. And the reason I raise it at all is because I worked for more than a decade with several other people on the Potawatomi Nation of Canada Treaty Entitlement claim against the American government. an interesting story, which we ultimately won, but then couldn't get the settlement money out of the United States government. Our champion, Senator Inouye of Hawaii, died before we were able to complete the work. The 1983 Potawatomi Trail of Death is another tragic narrative largely left out of Canadian American history texts. On my birth father's side, I'm Chippewa Mohawk and Otter Clan. Through him, I am a proud member and as often as possible resident of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation on beautiful Lake Simcoe, where I've lived in my community mostly full-time for the last 22 years. I'm Chippewa through my grandfather, Lorenzo Big Canoe, and I'm Mohawk through my grandmother, Tessie Delisle from Kahnawake, Quebec, a union created out of Canadian law because my grandfather, who attended Albert College in Belleville, Ontario, and became a certified teacher, could not teach in non-Indigenous schools in the 1920s. As an Indian, he could only teach on reserve, and that's how we met my grandmother at Kahnawake. The Wesley comes from my stepfather, Ronald Wesley, who was Oji Cree from the Cat Lake First Nation and Treaty 9 territory. His name always reminds me of the 12 years he spent in Indian residential school, having entered Shingwak at 4 years of age. It's a constant reminder, not only of the damage inflicted upon him as a small child, which made him an angry and violent man, but also of how blessed I am that I didn't attend residential school. Although, as an incorrigible child, the threat from my mother was always there. The residential school was closed in 1970, the year she would have sent me. Instead, I did end up in juvenile hall in Toronto, which was also a great learning opportunity. My task, though, however, was learning how to navigate his anger, his addictions, and the social, emotional, and sexual dysfunction of the many survivors in our urban community circles. I sent my grandfather to a reunion at Shingwak, or my stepfather, sorry, to a reunion at Shingwak when he was 51. And he told me this story. He said, when I arrived, I just wanted to throw a bomb into the place, but I kept going for you. So there was a man standing at the door and he asked me if I was Ron Wesley, and I said I was. And he told me he had been waiting for me. And when I asked him why, he said, when you were leaving, I was coming in and you gave me your bike. No one had ever given me anything before, and I really appreciated that bike. But more, when it got really bad in here, I had that bike and I was able to get away. And he said, and he wanted to thank him for that. So my stepfather continued in, and he was reminded that there had been some good times. He was reminded of some of the friendships that he'd had there. And when he died a different man. And when I did his memorial in Winnipeg in 2001, his brother, an elder, Ernie Wesley, told me that they had not really talked about any residential school at that point, but that they then would start to do so. Physician and author Gabor Mate points out something we might all try to heed when we think of survivors. He says, the opposite of addiction is connection. And this is important because there were very few, if any, loving adult-child connections in those schools. The children may have had each other, but they were children and powerless. They could not protect each other from the predators that ruled their lives, especially during the nights. And their reality has become the challenge of my life, because the awakening that has become the force in my life must come from healing the hurt that has continued to affect next generations. I believe as a society and as Indigenous peoples, we all have learned the hard way that hurt people, especially children. Let's just say if no attention is paid to the mental, emotional, and physical health of Indigenous peoples, or society is not adequately trauma-informed, there will be little to build a process of reconciliation upon. My parents and thousands of others, including immediate intergenerationals like myself, are the broken ground upon which the larger conversations on reconciliation in Canada have been sown. They spent 20 years between them at the Shingwak Indian Residential School. But the consequences of every survivor's adverse childhood experience kept spreading after they aged out at 16 or 18 years of age. Indian residential schools indelibly marked the 7 or 8 generations that went before them. It marked them and it marked us. And epigenetics tell us it can keep marking generation after generation indefinitely if we do nothing to change the trajectory of painful experiences, both historic and contemporary. Because of Indian residential schools, I was an urban Indian for most of my young life, although I spent considerable time on many reserves because my parents met fellow students from many places while in school. My worldview has been challenged many times, being raised in Toronto and constantly on the move because of violence, living in Palm Springs, California with the Agua Caliente peoples, living in a remote First Nation while I did my doctoral research. Every experience had a profound impact on my worldview, on my sense of indigeneity, and continues to feed my understanding of what we're up against in this reconciliation conversation. I am the Indigenous Chair for Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University, and I've been with Lakehead for almost 9 years, 3 in the position of Vice Provost, Indigenous Initiatives, last 6 as Chair, and I do well over 100 public and classroom presentations on truth and reconciliation and related issues annually. I'm also Chair of the Governing Circle for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, and have been a member of the Governing Circle for over 7 years. I was appointed as an honorary witness for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in June of 2014, having been a part of the Commission's work since the beginning of their process through the Canadian Roots Exchange, which was launched in the winter of 2007-8 here at the University of Toronto. So let me answer a question I'm often asked. What is an honorary witness? In May 2006, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was approved by all parties to the agreement. All parties included the government, the churches, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners, and of course, survivors. The implementation of the settlement agreement began in September 2007 with the aim of bringing a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of the residential schools. The settlement agreement determined that one of the objectives of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was to witness, support, promote, and facilitate truth and reconciliation events at both the national and regional levels. And I would add, including the local and community levels. The term witness is in reference to the Indigenous principle of witnessing. Honorary witnesses are called to be the keepers of history when an event of historic significance occurs. This is partly due to the oral traditions of Indigenous peoples, but also to recognize the importance of conducting business as well as building and maintaining relationships. One very important example of this that you're hopefully all aware of, excuse me, is the discoveries of the unmarked graves across Canada over the past year. This has become a rallying point for many Canadians. I'm saddened that it took this kind of evidence to capture the interest and support of the Canadian population, but I'm glad the stories told by countless survivors are now being believed in many places, especially in those places where they were previously disbelieved and denied. And this would include the federal and provincial courts. The revealing of the unmarked graves and recognition of those very real losses are finally allowing families of lost children to start their healing. Recognition of this larger truth is a first step towards restoring spiritual well-being to many Indigenous nations. Since January of 2022, over 10,000 unmarked graves have been confirmed, with over 3,000 already counted through the National Center archives before the recent discoveries. We know many thousands of children died in schools, running away from them or returning home sick from malnutrition and tuberculosis. So where did this conversation on truth and reconciliation begin? Several streams of activities have brought us to this place. There have been many, many attempts to quell or resolve historic grievances over hundreds of years. We might begin this particular era of dialogue 26 years ago with the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples and the unfortunately very limited discussions that came out of that massive conversation. I don't want to minimize any of the many important events, but we only have time to focus on a few significant steps that frame the truth and reconciliation process we're now in. As Vice Chief for the United Anishinaabe Councils, I testified at RCAP for Indigenous governments. In the end, I believe it was still a tad early for what we were looking for as Indigenous peoples, and many truths still lie waiting to be addressed in those reports as well. Government discourse on reconciliation didn't begin until the Government of Canada announced Gathering Strength, Canada's Aboriginal Action Plan, 24 years ago. The plan included the establishment of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and the first official statement of reconciliation. The foundation provided a significant illustration of how the provision of direct healing support and resources make it possible for Indigenous peoples to move healing and self-efficacy forward. It was 21 years ago that Indian Residential Schools Resolution Canada was created as a separate department with a mandate to address the legacy of Indian residential schools and to manage and resolve claims. Yet there are still many only now learning about this painful era in Canadian history simply because it has taken so long to get here. In May 2005, the government launched an advanced payment program for eligible former Indian residential school students who were 65 years of age and older. We were already losing many survivors at that point. Many never even made it to 65 because their traumatic experiences at those schools, the resulting violence, suicides and addictions, and the subsequent impacts of child welfare, which followed close behind. And who got to determine who was eligible? It certainly wasn't the survivors. In 2007, implementation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement began. Implementation of this historic agreement was to bring about a fair and lasting resolution to the legacy of Indian residential schools. Former students were supposed to benefit from the individual and collective measures provided by this agreement. A common experience payment for all eligible former students of Indian residential schools. Eligible meaning they could prove that they attended. All independent assessment process, an independent assessment process for claims of sexual or serious physical abuse, measures to support healing, commemoration monies, and the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was initiated in 2008. Prime Minister Stephen Harper also made an apology in June 2008. It took another 7 years for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to complete its work and table its reports in December 2015. Today, there remains unhappiness among survivors who felt they were lied to because the settlement agreement was negotiated and signed off prior to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because even the survivors themselves did not know the extent of damages to their peers on a Canada-wide basis. I've been told by survivors at the National Centre that they felt duped by the Government of Canada and believe they should be given an opportunity to revisit the entire agreement. The CRC process interviewed almost 7,000 survivors, and the common experience payments went to thousands more. The payments varied according to the length of time spent in an Indian residential school anywhere in Canada. My mother was a recipient of the common experience payment. She attended the Shingwalk Residential School in Ontario. She received monies for the year she spent away from her parents. However, money has never been the panacea for her or anyone else. The stories of hurt, of being taken away from loved ones and community remain a very common and painful narration still being felt, told, and lived in Indigenous communities across Canada. My mother's greatest regret was that she never got to know her parents. Her father died while she was away at school and she was not able to attend this funeral, and her mother died young as well. The common experience payment was for all students who attended the schools. This payment was meant to provide compensation to survivors without the need to disclose what, if any, abuse they suffered. They only had to report the school they attended, their full name, and the years they spent there. But it was not an errorless process. I'm sure many, including my mother, did not really understand the extent of the abuse they suffered. She had to ask me to clarify this when she told her stories, asking, was this abuse? Was this abuse? They did what they were told to do, even when it hurt, under this threat of severe consequences if they did not. Remember, they were children. To understand this, I recommend you read Five Little Indians by Michelle Good, winner of the Canada Reads this year, for an up close and personal review of how it felt as children and as adults. Also included in that settlement agreement was a 5-year endowment for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which opened in 1998 and ran for 16 years. It was closed in 2014 by the Stephen Harper government. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation was initially granted $350 million from the federal government out of the residential school settlement and tasked with directly funding communities to do their own healing work. It did not fund individuals. However, this foundation provided unprecedented support to community healing done by Indigenous peoples and contributed to many levels of healing. It contributed to raising education levels and secured empowerment of several next generations. It wasn't enough, however, and really needs to be continued for many, many more years. It did, however, have a profound impact when it came to understanding the truth. I worked with that foundation and helped to review applications for individual communities and healing centers. One of my personal tasks was to ensure we did not block any community getting funding because of a lack of technical proficiency. I did not want them to hire consultants to write the perfect proposal. I wanted their stories, their plans, their thinking, their goals in their words. Communities also had to have an elders advisory circle set up to guide the healing plan, and the foundation expected them to qualify their elders and request information on where they received their teachings and trainings, who recognized them, and to confirm whether they were members of the community submitting the proposal or had come from another place. We were likely the first organization in Canada to do this. We reviewed everything they sent and only made changes to bolster budgets, reduce them if necessary, or help them clarify their goals. We listened to them, and we only made changes or suggestions when it would make the process easier. It was a challenging experience for most reviewers, and many were traumatized by the experience. The stories contained in those proposals were explicit, and the idea of having to say no to any community was deemed exceptionally difficult by every reviewer. The independent assessment process was set up to adjudicate claims from students who had suffered extreme levels of abuse at the schools and wanted to testify. The IAP process interviewed almost 24,000 survivors and paid out close to $3 billion. This was an extremely difficult experience for survivors, but also for adjudicators, many of whom were Indigenous. And again, the stories were raw, sexually and physically explicit, and some of the adjudicators were themselves Indian residential school survivors, albeit working lawyers and professionals. Many survivors who testified began to drink alcohol again. Some drank themselves to death after being forced to relive the experiences of their childhoods in those sessions. There were suicides and intense anger. The adjudicators had to ask deep probing questions to elicit deeply truthful answers. This was a highly legalistic approach, and compensation was made on a grid system. How many times you were raped was taken into consideration in determining how much compensation was paid. A single rape is already a trauma. Imagine the pain of reliving multiple sexual assaults as a child when you had no help and no escape. There was re-traumatizing fear and deep shame in those memories, many of which had been deeply buried in the unconscious of survivors for years, and absolute horror at the responses they shared. It affected both sides of the process deeply, and this knowing comes from hearing some of those stories directly. I would not put into your minds that which has been indelibly put into mine. And the disbelief at what adults will do to children, especially children they regard as less than human. I think of the story of a grandmother who would not allow her children and grandchildren to sit on her lap because that place was a place of filth and disgust because of her experiences in residential school. Imagine living your entire life rejecting a part of your body because of the horrific memories it holds. And the message of rejection it sends to your family, her children, her grandchildren, a forbidden lap, normally a place of great comfort and love. The important thing is this conversation we are having today has a basis, a foundation, a deep reality that far too many Canadians are still not aware of or do not believe. The IAP process was essentially a secret process. Nothing was released as public documents and has been the center of several court cases on whether the documents should be sent to and kept at the National Center or destroyed. There remains deep contention about student-on-student abuse and revealing those who perpetuated abuses on children in those schools. This has been a very sensitive and harmful conversation for everyone. And of course, if you were an abuser, you didn't go home to your family and disclose that you had raped or beaten a child that day or at any time after. There are non-Indigenous families still carrying this truth, a secret that they may not even be aware of. They may also be experiencing intergenerational effects, just like us, legacy effects, without even knowing why. Some of our own leaders, elders, and community members were guilty of student-on-student abuse. And this has affected the health and well-being of our families and communities as well, except that we know all too well why. I think my greatest regret after a long and varied career trying to make right what was so very wrong is, as hard as I work, along with many others, to promote and help with healing, we have not erased the legacy effect. We have not been able to stop the continuous hurt, no matter how hard we try, how much we speak, how much we learn, or how much we teach. The legacy effect means that even though Indigenous people represent only 5% of the Canadian population, they represent 30.4% of the federal prison population. Or provincially, in a province like Manitoba, where Indigenous peoples represent 18% of the general population. They represent 77% of the prison population. In Ontario, they represent 3% of the general population, and they represent over 12% of the prison population here. This tells us there's a lot more to do. And that, everyone, is a very painful truth. A truth that has not been changed or mitigated in any way by the question or pursuit of truth and reconciliation in this country. Yes, there is a bigger picture that must be taken on by governments, the churches, education, organizations, and corporations, but I believe our responsibility, and I'm talking about individuals, families, and communities, lies in dismantling the biases and beliefs in and around us. The truth we are seeking is buried beneath what has always been for Indigenous peoples, largely inaccessible advantage and rampant discrimination. The truth we want revealed waits impatiently in the darkness of denial for change to happen and grow. It has always been my hope that shining a bright light on truth would allow us all to move forward together, heal injustice, and ensure an inclusive and equitable future for everyone. I know, quite the dream. There is a hidden and omnipresent reality of a multiplicity of violences we are not, perhaps willfully, comprehending here. Here in this darkness, we find the reality of an unrelenting legacy of colonization, marginalization, unresolved grief, and intergenerational trauma. We are all witnesses over and over again to the effects of colonialism in society. We know who gets to make the grand decisions. So why have we not learned? Why can we not speak aloud truths we all see, feel, and sometimes lament? Former Prime Minister Paul Martin put it to me this way. He said, 40% of the population of Canada knows and accepts there must be change and we must do better. 30% don't give a damn. They don't care and they don't want to talk about it. And 30% are sitting on the fence. He said, forget the 30% in the middle. They'll never change their minds. Focus on the 40% who want to see change happen, and the ones sitting on the fence, convince them, bring them together, build critical mass, secure your laws, legislation, and go for whatever it is you need to make the necessary changes. To do this, Canadians as a whole must acknowledge who got to provide the interpretation of words shared during initial discussions, agreements, and treaties most forcibly put in place with Indigenous peoples, and understand who got to make those critical decisions that ultimately affected everything, especially the places Indigenous peoples inhabited. Arriving Europeans, trappers, miners, settlers, and a variety of officials always had different things to say about what happened, what was happening, and what was about to happen. It was they who would determine the outcomes, none of it inclusive of the Indigenous peoples already situate on the lands, resources, and vast territories of this entire continent, because they just didn't matter in the divvying up of those lands and resources and the abject pursuit of more. Jonathan Lear's book, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation, provides a philosophical inquiry of a statement by Crow warrior Plentycoo, who said, when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and they could not lift them up again. After this, nothing happened. Yet despite this, Indigenous peoples have somehow sustained a never say die attitude. And although they too have had occasion to say things like, after this, nothing happened, this being the end of their way of life because of the occupation of their lands and the forced colonization of their minds. This because even contemporary conversations and public inquiry so far have not budged opposition to their calls to action. They've continued to fight and remind everyone who will listen that there's still work to do and significant matters to resolve. Of course, this wasn't truly or completely the end, or was it? The Crow continued living, as did Plentycoo, and almost every Indigenous nation across Canada. The question is not, did we survive? That's quite obvious. The question is how we survived, what we endured, and what we have been left with. In a country with the landmass and wealth of Canada, we really should have recovered by now. The problem is the actions and platitudes delivered have mostly been spoken and written with that proverbial forked tongue and have not been challenged until recently by Canadians. There have been many hurdles and barriers and intractable circumstances to navigate by Indigenous peoples. So we are naturally suspicious of the current push for reconciliation and who gets to control the narrative, the resources, and the outcomes. My grandfather, Lorenzo Big Canoe, had a similar thing to say when he was being promised even more promises by the federal government in 1951. He said, there is no point in promising us anything because much of what you promise is already inherently ours. The truth is, nothing will matter much to any of us until we lift the morale of the people, or as Plenty Coups would have put it, until the hearts of our people are no longer on the ground. Colonialism for Indigenous peoples has become a never-ending process of looking up, way up, and trying to determine if the climb is worth the cost. Has it ever been? And you won't understand the impossibility of the price for Indigenous peoples until you understand and accept that not everyone wants to be you, unless the you being wished upon us will implement and truly honor the concept of land acknowledgement. Not the lovely things now said in the beginning of a coming together online or in person, but a true acknowledgement of the lands, waters, resources, and lifeways we all need to live forward into the future in a good and safe way. We've consistently been asking you to come back to the land, back to the teachings, and to respect natural law, because despite a very dangerous love affair with capitalism, the earth is your mother and your next generations as well. So we've talked a lot about the historic, talked a lot about the losses, talked a lot about bad negotiations and lamented needed change, and we've talked a lot about the truth. The truth, however, has never set us free. And there have been many who would likely agree it has instead immobilized us in so many ways, even as it has moved us in many questionable directions. Sharing our truth has seemingly galvanized demands for equity and inclusion in critical spaces, and has repeatedly taken us out into the streets. But any real freedoms we have achieved have been very hard won and remain very hard to see and feel in too many places where the struggle continues day by day. So unbundling the paradox of reconciliation in Canada. What is a paradox? A paradox is a statement or proposition that, despite sound or apparent sound reasoning from acceptable premises, leads us to a conclusion that seems senseless, logically unacceptable, and self-contradictory. Because here we are, it's 2022, and we've been intensely discussing reconciliation in a multitude of forums for a multitude of years. I personally have been working on reconciliation for most of my adult life, close to 40 years now. And my approaches have been based on what I lived through as a child of Indian residential school attendees. I have needed from deep within me to understand what happened and why, and finally to know unequivocally and now how it can be corrected. Like most of you, my life work has been premised on my life experiences, which has been the driving force of my taking leadership, advocacy, and being of service very seriously. Therefore, it strains the limits of my reality to accept that this idea of being seen, felt, and heard positively is actually happening, because in so many ways, I feel we've only ever been seen in a very negative light. The harshness of being seen and heard in ways that are not conducive to in believing we can achieve or find eminent success hurts. It's very hard to explain how it looks from here, how I can see the good things achieved by significant numbers of Indigenous people across Canada, interspersed with and at times buried beneath the many unfortunate things I know are still going on. Early death, suicide, addictions, ACEs, incarceration rates, and abject poverty, which amplify the seemingly intractable grievances and legacy effects. It's hard to explain how the entire 65 years of my life have tumbled in and out of harms and gifts. You can look at me and see good. You can perhaps see what society regards as success: a good education, a solid marriage, healthy children, albeit with their own intergenerational concerns. But what you can't see is the ever-present memories, the lingering traumas of family addictions, neglect, family violence, dysfunctional sexualities, and the fear, instability, and hurt lodged forever at my core. For me, it's become the holding onto of relearned powerful historic perspectives, of knowing what was right before it all went wrong. I'm aware this is especially difficult for those of us who are not us. For those who have not been exposed to our stories, our knowledge keepers, our elders, our truths. But I'm also aware that us now includes you in so many ways. The you who is trying so hard to understand circumstances that are beyond your experience. I want you to continue to try. I want you to listen. I want you to learn. I want you to know it is the only way. My understanding and accepting you and you doing the same for me and every other Indigenous person in this beautiful country we call home, no matter our life circumstances. Indigenous peoples have suffered, and some of you have suffered as well. I am very aware of this. I often say 97% of the population has experienced some form of trauma, and the other 3% are lying. So there is much we can relate to in each other. There is much we can heal in each other, and there is much all young people in this country are trying to show us. Today, there are many, many more Indigenous, non-Indigenous, grassroots folks, academics, business people, and political figures out there trying to do the same, trying to understand. This is an interesting process because there are multiple voices advocating for what's right. But what's right? Is what's right for Canada right for Indigenous peoples? Is what's right for Indigenous peoples right for Canada? And who, pray tell, gets to make that determination, that decision, and form that conclusion? We would like it to be us this time with your respectful participation. No matter what, you can see we're not going away, we're not forgetting, and even if you personally don't like it or accept it, we believe absolutely it will be done. So where does the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People have to offer this dialogue, and who's actually listening? What about the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples already mentioned, or the multitude of reports that have been drafted both for and against the wishes and lifeways of Indigenous peoples, their spiritual practices, their livelihoods, their governments, and their families? Not much is likely to be achieved by establishing new parchment barriers, to borrow James Madison's phrase, referring to mere words on paper. What have those reports, case law, or legislation provided as actual guides or pathways to resolution of this reconciliation question that will ever satisfy either side? So far, most represented what one of the chiefs I worked with called genocide by paper, and have served to galvanize Indigenous determination rather than to quell it. We have looked at the terms reconciliation, conciliation, colonization, decolonization, indigeneity, indigenization, restoration, from virtually every angle, and we still cannot find our way nor recognize when we are even close. The commingling of decolonization with indigenization has presented us with an interesting and possibly irresolvable dichotomy in this country. They are very different things, but they have been transposed and co-opted in a variety of ways that have effectively obscured any pathway forward through the present meanings and usefulness. Consequently, in far too many places, we are now all equally paralyzed by uncertainty. Perhaps this is because for a very long time, there have been two very distinct camps advocating for very different things, who have seemingly come together to pursue a process of reconciliation, yet in truth remain very far apart in their ultimate objectives. We have not established clear goalposts as a country. We do not appear to know when we have achieved a solution or even reached a compromise, and still people are suffering. And things that must change remain the same. We've had some of those conversations already on treaty implementation, land claims resolution, the restoration of jurisdiction and authority over our own children, proper housing and food security, access to clean water, harm reduction and access to treatment, and healthy culturally based mental and physical wellness approaches. Indigenous peoples can point to successes, but I would argue those successes are in spite of, not because of, any mutual process of reconciliation taking place in the very spaces that must take the responsibility of embedding systemic and consistent change. Thankfully, we have entered a time when there is a welcome and pressing need for more Indigenous faculty and knowledge keepers in all disciplines and levels, and educational materials that critically address the collusion of Canadians, whether consciously or unconsciously, in Canada's quest for the assimilation of Indigenous peoples and unfettered access to their lands and resources. So coming back to the TRC, I think one of the most important considerations from the beginning of the commission was the need to ensure Canada as an entire country understood that this was not meant to be solely an Indigenous conversation. None of the things I'm raising are. It was and is an all of Canada conversation, and was supposed to embrace the entire population of this country, and we still want that today. This is because it's difficult to talk about truth, and more importantly, the question of reconciliation, if you're only speaking to yourself. Indigenous peoples know what the historic grievances in this country are. They don't need to reiterate them. They want to have them acknowledged and healed with Canada's participation. Therefore, it's imperative that everybody be invited to join the conversation And even though we eventually had many thousands of allies and friends join in and attend TRC events and public walks, there are still far too many Canadians who remain unaware of the Commission's work, the 94 calls to action, or the 10 principles established to guide a reconciliation process into the future. And many Indigenous peoples will tell you they do not believe we have yet exhausted the truth. And therefore, they do not believe a living process of reconciliation is even possible, even though many components were put in place to try and center and bring understanding and acceptance of the truths forward. So has the entire truth been revealed? Are survivors and those Canadians who are aware satisfied? Is reconciliation even possible under the circumstances I've described? And where do we go from here? I believe we still have many conversations to ignite, many relationships to build. Making a personal connection is imperative to understanding and accepting each other. It is not possible to solve this dilemma from afar. I've always advocated the breaking of bread together, attendance at events, reading of books, the invitation of elders, the joining of laughter, and the sharing of stories, not only as allies, but as friends, companions, champions, thereby creating a true representation of all my relations. Despite all the writing, discussions, arguments, laments, and even blaming and shaming, without that personal connection and the building and sustaining of strong relationships, we cannot touch the core elements of this reconciliation paradox. Elders have shared how we can look at what is happening around us and work to understand it so we can open a broader vision. Then we will see and understand the reason Indigenous peoples call this continent Turtle Island, and understand and appreciate the layers and layers of ancestral living and dying, knowledge exchanges, spiritual practices, and teachings that are still there and make this land so much us and us so much the land. When asked what lays beneath the turtle, elders will tell you there are turtles all the way down. A powerful spiritual lesson, beautifully illustrating Indigenous connection to the land, a connection that gave us health and well-being for thousands of years and continues to be a sustaining force. What might we visualize to illustrate and understand the layer upon layer of colonialism, development, and concrete that has been heaped upon those very same people since contact? Yes, there are turtles all the way down in the Indigenous cosmology, but to truly understand their value as a country, we must remove the devastating layers and layers of colonialism and rejection that have buried them and kept them out of sight. I can cite several stories of non-Indigenous individuals who have shared how their connection to the truth of Indigenous peoples has changed their lives. Yes, I've heard about and even been invited to talk about equity, diversity, inclusion into what I ask, because accepting an invitation is not a joining of the forces of colonization, it already believing itself to have eaten all that we are. We are still standing, our hearts are lifting, and we are steadily walking into the creation of a new world for our children, despite the resistance of that which lies deep within the structures of this country and the belief that we are not enough, have never been enough, and that we never will be. We, however, remember and know differently. Healthy people keep every sense alert. Most are keenly aware that everything is deeply influenced by the state of media, external influences on our communities, and local, regional, national activities and opinion. We know we live in a complex world. We know it all too well. And we have navigated and adapted to some pretty incredible odds. We are world-class adapters. And really, this is how and why we have survived. The question for somebody like me and many others, I'm sure, is what are we adapting to? And how do we ignite the seventh fire prophecy of change and renewal in all Indigenous lives and Canadian society so we can leave behind the very real poverty of spirit and unrelenting stereotypes placed upon us? One way is to tell our own stories. There's a wonderful African parable I learned about recently. It's about a little boy who says to his grandfather, "Grandfather, is it true that the lion is the king of the jungle?" And grandfather says, "Yes, my grandson, it's true." Well, if the lion is the king of the jungle, then why do all the stories we read and hear about have the hunter wrestle the lion, overcome the lion, and capture the lion? And the grandfather smiles at the young boy, pats him on the head and says, "That would not be so if the lion were telling the story." So I know how important it is that we tell our own stories, that we tell our own truths, and that we continue to do so for as long as it takes. So I set a foundation for this conversation on reconciliation I want to talk a little bit about enacting reconciliation and building on this truth to make a difference. I want to ask each of you to tackle reconciliation from a micro level, the place where we live, and to keep things going. How do we bring this together? It's acceptance and acknowledgement is fundamental to reconciliation. Not our getting along, not our even getting specific fiscal or other supports. I believe it's still about dismantling some fundamental beliefs on both sides. The side that felt it was all right to claim, develop, and ultimately destroy so much to get more. We all know this getting to more has not ended. Our society has a deeply entrenched fixation on capitalism, even though it is killing our planet. And equally important is killing us and other living beings. Legitimization of more and unattainable privileges are bandied about by one side of this paradox as if it is the only truth. But we are all facing new truths today, that of global uncertainty, extreme changes in weather and climate as temperatures shift across the planet, shortages of potable water, sustainable energy. We're all eventually grappling with insecure food availability, and now we're facing the expansion of war. However, on the other side, Indigenous peoples have never stopped talking about the restoration of jurisdiction and authority over their lands, their children, their food sources, and their lives. They've never stopped demanding the consideration of humanity for the planet of Turtle Island and asking us to think generations forward and remember 7 generations back to ensure we're reminded that we all have responsibility for the future and everyone in that future. So what is acceptance? Acceptance is acknowledgement that Indigenous peoples have the right to benefit from longstanding agreements, treaties, statements, and legal decisions that are restorative and regenerative. Of those agreements, they have the right to choose, to challenge, to collaborate, and to make decisions in their own best interest. At a minimum, Canadians must ensure that Canada will cease to interfere in Indigenous decision-making, that the provinces will stop removing their children, and support the reconstitution of their cultures, languages, and the expansion of their traditional knowledge bases, governance systems, and spiritual practices. What was taken away must be acknowledged, accepted, and restored, or there will not be reconciliation of any consequence. What is fairness? If we want to move steadily towards reconciliation, that conversation on equity, diversity, and inclusion is worth considering and reconsidering. It's also important to consider the reconstitution of an Indigenous Healing Foundation, which did an incredible amount of work and contributed to the healing we see today in Indigenous communities across Canada. Restorative programs should be recreated, such as the National Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Program, government funded, but Indigenous led, cultural, driven by community members and the youth, because healing is still essential to where we want to go. The provincial and federal governments must let go of the reins of control and accept the need for Indigenous peoples to fully restore their own institutions and knowledge centers. This isn't going to be a quick process, but it's necessary to lift Indigenous peoples and to create those connections which stop the addictions, premature deaths, and ongoing harms. This means something important for all of Canada. And finally, what is reconciliation? We've always been aware as Indigenous peoples that a truthful review of the historic patterns of destruction promulgated since contact on this continent and the consequent devastation of Indigenous social efficacy will also require multiple layers of action, academic and personal, by present and next generations who are being tasked with mitigating the damages of colonial practice. So when Indigenous scholars, elders, students, and knowledge keepers express fatigue at explaining, re-explaining, and constantly reiterating why we're even part of this conversation, we must continue because it's not done. We are not done because what is really important has not permeated the consciousness of all Canadians. And it means supporting the healing that must continue, helping to break the negative cycles created from contact forward through the Indian removal periods, the Indian wars and killing, the Indian residential schools, the Indian hospitals, the medical experiments, the child welfare experiments, the long-term and continuing harms of child welfare, the education experiments, the co-optation of the indigenization process, and so much more. And finally, when it comes to you and me, I believe it is a simple matter of doing that micro reconciliation, and working towards those elements you understand and have access to together at home, at your spiritual centers, our educational institutions, and in your own families and communities. Put your eyes and hearts on what you can do and just do more of that. I am not expecting grand gestures. What I am, and likely everyone else is looking for, is heartfelt action. So thank you, Miigwech.
Okay, well, thank you, Nyawagoa Miigwech, Cynthia, for that really thought-provoking, but more than thought-provoking. I think one of the things that really, to me, really came clear was so many different people have different understandings of residential schools and some of the things, I would say a fraction. As you mentioned, there's so many truths that we still need to learn, but it's not just that fact about understanding and learning about them, but it's how do we become engaged, and how do people who, as you mentioned, those who want to do something, they're always looking for different ways to become engaged, but those who are on the fence, how does that travel from the head to the heart to become more engaged? And I think, to me, that was something that became clear, and I'm hoping that people also do understand. At this time, we have time for 2 questions, and so how I'm going to ask, if you can either put your question, please put your question in the Q&A box, and I will be able to, I'll read it. And if we don't get any that way, I am going to, what I'm going to do then, ask for someone to raise their hand, but I think we have one question that has come in. So Cynthia, this is, someone was asking if you can please explain the paradox of the 2 views. Oh, and this came from Joan DaCosta.
Well, I think it's a long question. Sorry I didn't explain that well enough, but the paradox is in the fact that, that there are 2 very distinctive views between Canadians and what they see as being necessary to resolve this outstanding grievance, and between Indigenous peoples who see the other. So one wants to keep everything that they have and continue on that pathway, and Indigenous peoples are saying, you're on the wrong pathway, you need to come back this way, and you need to restore the integrity and quality and lands to Indigenous peoples and listen to what we have to say. Otherwise, there isn't going to be any conversation down the line, because everybody's going to perish. We have to really start thinking about all those kinds of things. So the paradox, is in all the nice words that are said around reconciliation and the realities that underlie it.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'm going to see if we have any other questions that have come in. I think we can do one more. And also, too, if you actually want to raise your hand, we will take one that way as well. If we have no one that's putting into the Q&A, if you raise your hand, you can actually just say your question ask your question to Cynthia. I would ask, though, if you can keep it brief. So do we have anyone that's, if you raise your hand, the people in the background will help get your camera up for you to answer. We're getting a lot of different talk in the chat. I think I do have one quick question for you, and it was just something that you were speaking about, and the thing that you outlined was kind of all the things that have happened over time. And hopefully you have a short answer for this, because it could be, I don't know, it could be a long one. You mentioned 1996, the RCAP. You mentioned the apology in 2008. We talked about the TRC and all the things that have happened. Why do you think it has taken so long for general public to become more engaged with it now with the TRC than when RCAP came out?
Listening to my dog trying to get out of a room. I think it's because it was really kept under wraps. I mean, the government of Canada did not want to have a real, Canada-wide discussion on what had happened over the course of time. It's Canada's best kept secret. And now all of a sudden it's out there. And the TRC was very instrumental, I think, because it went coast to coast. And then the unmarked graves have really been the catalyst for actually opening up the conversation a lot more. So it's, we've been at this for well over 150 years. That's the reality. But in the last 26 years, the government of Canada is actually engaged in the conversation and taken it out into the public domain. So once it hits the public domain, it's everybody's game. It's not hidden away anymore. So that's why we're at the place where we are. And I don't think people really truly understand how much time and effort has been put into this conversation on the Indigenous side of the equation. We have not let up forever. And, and we're not going to let up forever, because this has to get done, and there has to be a restorative process and a regenerative process put in place and recognized by all of Canada. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you again. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for your time and your words, and really thought-provoking, as I mentioned earlier. Just kind of a walkthrough of all the things that even appreciate so much that you've been able to also share. You just didn't talk about it from kind of an outsider point of view, but bring in that aspect of story within your own family and those experiences and what has driven you. So I am so appreciative along with everyone else here. And we can see by everyone who's writing in the chat right now in the sense of how you touch them and the things that they've been, that they get to think about a little bit more. So again, I like to say on behalf of everyone here, Nyawagoa, thank you so much. It was awesome seeing you again. And now I am going to pass it on to Shannon. So thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Miigwech, Cynthia, what an amazing talk today. I always love listening to you speak, and you give me so many things to think about and things to think about differently. So I really appreciate that. And Miigwech, Jonathan, for moderating Cynthia's talk today and holding it all together for us. Thank you. We are going to take a short break now. We're just a couple of minutes behind schedule, but not too bad. But we're going to give you until 10:50. Instead of just giving you 4 minutes. So take a stretch, make a tea, get a snack, do whatever you need to do, and we will see you back promptly at 10:50. Welcome back, everyone. I hope everyone was able to move around a bit during the break. We have still a packed schedule for everyone before we wrap things up at 11:30. So I want to move right into our panel discussion for today. We have 3 panelists that are joining us today. So I will introduce all 3 and then we will just dive right into the panel. We have Susan Hill with us today. Susan is a member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. She is the director at the Center for Indigenous Studies and the academic advisor to the Provost on Indigenous Curriculum and Education. We have Archana Sridhar. Archana is the assistant provost in the office of the vice president and provost here at U of T. And we also have Suzanne Stewart. Suzanne is a member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. She is a registered psychologist and director of the Wakibanes Bryce Institute for Indigenous Health at the Dalalana School of Public Health. Suzanne is also the academic advisor to the Provost on Indigenous Research and Ethics. All 3 full bios will be in the chat so that you can read more on these 3 amazing colleagues of ours here at U of T. I'm really excited for this discussion. As I mentioned, in the Office of Indigenous Initiatives is 5 years, just 5 years and 1 month, I think is the exact date of how long the office has been here at U of T, which means this past January was when the 34 calls to action were presented to the president and the provost. So it'll be really exciting to see some of the work that has happened, where we're heading in the future, what things we should be focusing on, and just what some of these thoughts are, and get some questions from our audience as well about how we can keep moving forward with these calls to action. So I will start off with the first. I have a few questions and then we will have time for Q&A at the end. So the first question for our panel today is, what are some initiatives you think you have been a leader in terms of reconciliation and moving forward our 34 calls to action? I'm maybe can I start with you, Susan, today?
Sure. Thanks so much for including me today. And I wanted to say nyawa to Cynthia in particular for the amazing keynote and so many things for us to think about and to learn more about. In thinking about some of the initiatives that I've seen at U of T around reconciliation, there's a lot of things I could talk about, but there's just a few I'll touch on quickly and encourage people to look into these if you're not already familiar. One would be the Provost's Fund for hiring Black and Indigenous faculty. I think that has been amazing for helping change the terrain at the university and provides lots of opportunity for future development in that area. There's also a parallel fund for the hiring of Indigenous staff, which I think is actually fairly unique for other Canadian institutions. You don't often hear about that conversation about efforts to increase the complement of Indigenous staff. And I think that's so critical, particularly when we think about student-facing staff and how vital that is. Also, the Provost Postdoctoral Fellowships for Black and Indigenous scholars has been a really fundamental effort to increase opportunities, focusing on Black and Indigenous scholars at that postdoctoral level, which we know is critical often for that piece of training that is much harder to get, particularly in certain fields. And so that I think has been very innovative for our campus. Other schools have been doing that in different ways. And I think ultimately, if we're thinking about assessing ourselves, it's about assessing how we make ourselves better rather than worrying so much about how we might rate in connection to other institutions. A couple other pieces is that I see increasing efforts around self-reflection. And ultimately, that's what's necessary if we're actually going to get to a place of betterment in terms of being able to honestly look at where we are, where we've been, in order to make sure that where we're going is actually going to be based upon a better relationship with Indigenous communities, with Indigenous nations, and with our Indigenous students. And of course, support along with that for our Indigenous staff and faculty. And then also taking that to the divisional level. It's not just the leadership from the top. It is, and that helps to set the stage for all of the other entities within the university. But knowing how much hard work is going in at the divisional levels within the different faculties and within the different campuses. And again, it's that willingness to be deeply reflective and to be able to recognize those things that have not been good to date. Because you can't improve if you don't recognize where improvement is needed. So I'm really hopeful for the future, because I see that as a really a base from which we're working from at the university. Yeah.
Nyawa, Susan. Suzanne, do you want to share anything on this question?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. I just want to also start by saying thank you to our Elder Andrew Wesley for the beautiful prayer and grounding us in spirit, and for Cynthia. And I just love the clear and concise way that she shared everything and made it really understandable in her words and her stories. So merci cho for that. Well, I'm not really sure where to start. That's a great question. And, you know, I'm someone who has to be honest about my thoughts and feelings. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a straight shooter. And I have to say that from that place of honesty and truth, I do love and respect the University of Toronto, but I'm also aware that the University of Toronto is still trying to catch up on where it needs to be in terms of reconciliation, equity, diversity, and inclusion, all of these things. And you know, the reason that I'm here and I love the University of Toronto so much is because of that self-reflection that Dr. Hill talked about, and that willingness to engage and take a look at some of these things and address them in a transparent and honest way. And I feel really honored to be part of that. And that includes things such as the development of the Indigenous Research Network and the Black Research Network. These are courageous things that the university, from its dominant model of leadership, decided to support and undertake, and to do that in a good way, meaning to put it into the hands of community members. That's some of us here today and many other people who aren't here, and allow us to do things in culturally safe and culturally based ways, and to allow Indigenous and Black faculty, for instance, I can only speak about those because those are the people I know and that I've worked with, to have that latitude and to have that responsibility, and to really start to move away from that sort of patriarchal, filial sort of relationship that the university has historically had, that universities have historically had with Indigenous people, which is, oh, you're Indigenous, go over there and just do Indigenous studies, make dream catchers, build totem poles, paint murals. Yeah, all of those beautiful things are continuing, but at the same time, systemic change that involves policy, that involves ethics, that involves hiring, that involves all kinds of things at the system level are starting to shift. And I'm very impressed by the university's willingness to undertake that. And I'm very honored to be able to be part of that.
Miigwech, Suzanne. Archana, do you want to add to this one?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I also want to say thank you to Andrew for such a wonderful opening, and Cynthia, that talk was amazing and so thought-provoking. And I also want to thank Shannon for including me on this panel. And I've really been honored to work with Shannon and with Suzanne and Susan over the past few years in building and supporting this work from the Provost's office. In terms of where we've been a leader, I actually have the same kind of thought that both of you have articulated around, you know, I think U of T in some ways is still catching up. I think the progress over the past few years with the support of faculty, like both of you, has just been incredible to see. And the office's annual report that's going through governance right now is such a testament to the growth of this work. The thing that came to mind for me was a theme of visibility, and that I think we are finally becoming more of a leader in making visible and shining a light on all of the contributions of the Indigenous members of our community. So the faculty hiring fund that Susan mentioned, I think has been an incredible piece. And I believe U of T was one of the first in Canada to do something like this, dedicate funding to support faculty who are Black and Indigenous. And that has an impact from what we hear from the students, to have faculty members who understand their experience, who they can share their experiences with, or pursue lines of inquiry and ways of knowing that we may not have had the resources for before. I also have noticed a real shift in U of T communications and Division of University Advancement when it comes to highlighting and profiling star researchers, students, programming, so that all of the efforts of members of our Indigenous community are made visible, and really feels more inclusive than when we see things like the U of T magazine or U of T news. And that to me is really special. And the report really highlights that too. And I know that we've been a leader, and Shannon was a leader in terms of First Nations House, which has long been such a supportive community, especially for Indigenous students. So having a place to come together and find community, to have elders and mentors and programming and ceremony, I think that has really been an important site of leadership from U of T. I know we'll get into sort of the future looking. I've been really happy to see some of the visible public art that's starting to happen. I think there's a lot more room for art and architecture. So I know we'll get into sort of future looking a little later, but things like the installation in Hard House Great Room is really beautiful. And the temporary installations outside of Hard House, I think, are a great example of seeing more vibrancy on our campus. Thank you again.
Thank you, Archana. Okay, we'll move on to another area. And I'll maybe, if the panelists, if this question is particularly exciting to you, if you want to raise your hand, then you can go first. What are the main areas you think U of T needs to focus on and prioritize to move forward with reconciliation? Anyone want to go first?
I can go first, and then
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure the others will have really awesome stuff to add to it. When I think of that, I think first about our outreach to and our engagement with Indigenous communities, and particularly with Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee communities as the original peoples of this territory, as well as outreach to and engagement with the amazing and beautiful Toronto Indigenous urban community, in understanding again that recognition of starting from where you're at in order to be global. But you can't really be global if you're not taking care of what's literally in your backyard and your front yard. And so that I see as our primary place. Very close to that is about improved supports for our Indigenous students, increasing those supports and improving everything that we already have as well. And then more of an internal piece, but I know it's one that often comes up, is about better systems of data so that we have that mechanism to better assess ourselves in where we've made strides and where we're still lagging in terms of our own goals. And I see that primarily as an internal piece, but with that potential to also use it for external, but we have to have it for our own purposes to be able to understand what we've accomplished and what we still need to be increasing our efforts about. And I'll pass it to Archana and Suzanne.
Hi, Suzanne, I don't know if you would like to go. I had two ideas, which was really touching, I think, on the academic mission based on like the Provost office point of view. And one of them is curriculum change. And I know that Susan has been doing so much to help guide ideas that come forth from departments and divisions, and often creating new courses, changing content of courses, revising, degree program curriculum. Those are hard things in the university sometimes because of all of the sort of long-standing academic traditions or the pace of collegial governance. So I think that's an area that we are prioritizing under Professor Hill, and sort of growing that, like seeing the growth of the Center for Indigenous Studies, seeing more experiential learning content, seeing more focus on health inequities like Professor Stewart's doing in public health, like that, growing that kind of work, I know is starting to happen in law and anthropology and global affairs and education. So kind of seeing those initiatives bear fruit, I think will be one main area. And then the other is just faculty retention. So building on what we said about the hiring fund, I think it's really important to make sure that Indigenous scholars who join our community truly feel included and belong and are supported towards tenure, continuing appointment, so that mentorship towards leadership roles in the future is also really taken into account. So those would kind of be the two. That might also mean kind of finding new ways of evaluating research and teaching and Indigenous ways of knowing, that I'm really excited to see people talking about and thinking about from the faculty side.
Is it okay if I say a few things now? I think that these are all fantastic ideas and recommendations that really need to continue to go forward and gain momentum. And there's one really critical, fundamental missing piece, and that is that there is currently less than 0.5% of Indigenous faculty at U of T doing the work of a much greater percentage of the pie of this work that needs to be done. So when we look at all these great things that we're talking about today, that U of T is prioritizing with reconciliation, how can they really legitimately expect less than 0.5% of its faculty to undertake all of this work that's supposed to shift the paradigm of the university in some ways? I mean, it's not tenable in that way. And that is why we have little to no senior Indigenous faculty here. Most of our faculty are assistant or associate professors, many of whom don't go on to full professor because of the overwhelming amount of the workload that keeps people from fulfilling the requirements of promotion within the academic realm. So if we're really serious about moving the reconciliation envelope forward, we need to really do a mass hiring of Indigenous people. And I don't mean one person every 3 years in each school. I mean like 15 people in each school. And in order to create equity, because that's really one of the things that this whole event is about promoting is equity, because it's really not equitable to have a handful of people. So of around the 20 some Indigenous faculty that are U of T, probably 5 have the ability within their workload to engage at the systems change level beyond just doing their work. So basically we have less than 10 Indigenous people doing all of this change work. And that's why people like Susan or myself or other people I know work 60 hours a week, are triple booked in every aspect of their work, don't seem available or show up late to appointments and meetings. And it's not because we're sitting around watching TV and eating bonbons. It's because we're carrying this huge reconciliation file and this Indigenous file at the university, and it really lacks that equity in terms of the workload. And I think what has to happen is a massive amount of Indigenous people need to be hired at the faculty and staff level.
Thank you to all of you. Those are all really good points. I'm really thinking about what Suzanne just said, because I know for myself, I've been saying over the past 5 years, we have gained so many staff and faculty at a rate, because I've been here for a long time, at a rate that I've never seen before. All like new positions or expanding units, and more faculty have come in than I've ever seen before. And so I've been saying, oh, like we have more people now, we have more people to share the work, but the work exploded at that exact same time. So the amount of work and the amount of people interested in engaging with Indigenous community at U of T and beyond is through the roof as well. So we can't keep up. It doesn't feel, because I'm wondering, why doesn't it feel like there's more people? But there's way more work than there was even the amount of people we brought on. So I agree, and I don't have a solution other than, yeah, more people, and no more work, no more expansion. But I do love, I mean, we love that there is interest finally, because for years there really wasn't a ton of interest in engaging with Indigenous community at U of T, but we have that now. So we want to make sure we keep those relationships growing and keep building on them. Just lost my questions here there. So I do have 2 more questions, but I am conscious of the time. We might just get to one, and then I might move to the questions from the Q&A, but we can see how time goes. So I just want to hear from the 3 of you on what institutions, either nationally or globally, do you think have been successful as models for leadership with reconciliation? Does anyone want to start? Can I just pick someone? Because Susan's going to steal all the good answers if you don't go first. I'm going to try Suzanne this time.
Well, I think UBC has historically done an excellent job at the systems level. You know, I'm sure that there are some difficulties there. There are challenges everywhere, but I think systemically they were ahead of the game in many respects. 20 years ago, they were doing stuff that we're just starting to do now.
Yes, I think that in so many ways we look to UBC to see where we should have been. But yeah, does anyone have anywhere else, even outside of Canada or beyond, or are we just looking at UBC?
So actually, Shannon, I thought about an initiative actually that's happening that I'm sure is going to have its bumps along the road, but that I think is innovative. In the University of California system, they've just instituted free tuition for state residents who are members of federally recognized tribes. Now, California, of course, is complicated, as every place is, but in that they have a number of Native American communities that are not federally recognized as a result of the layers of genocide that were inflicted upon the peoples of California. But interestingly enough, one of those communities has actually stepped up with their own grant to support members, Native American members who are residents of the state from non-federally recognized tribes. And that's, I actually looked it up. It's the Federated Indians of Graton Rancheria. So there we actually are seeing the state stepping up in terms of a recognition of their responsibilities, and then a community actually in some ways calling them out, but also then making an effort to support those people who the state has left out in that system. And so I think it's a really interesting example for our institutions to be looking at and to be thinking about how we can do something similar and hopefully something that is inclusive.
I'd also thought about UBC, and I was particularly thinking about their libraries and kind of the important role of preservation and in partnership with Indigenous communities. And I know UBC is the home to the archives of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there was a lot of work that went into thinking about how to house those archives in a way that was in partnership. And so I think that's an area that has been a model for thinking about preservation and the importance of kinds of things that Cynthia was telling us about around remembering and stories. And then in the States, I know in Arizona State has been also a leader in building partnerships with high schools in the state to bring people to university from Indigenous communities, and then has kind of a 4-year, some kinds of cohorted programs with mentors and things like that. And so I think that kind of holistic wraparound student supports that Susan and Suzanne were talking about earlier in the last question is another area to think about in terms of models.
Thank you. Yeah, those are all really good things to think about, and to ways. I mean, there's sometimes different ways we can think about them here at U of T, but I think, I mean, I'm really open to just expanding the way the things that we consider possible, and seeing what other institutions have been able to do. I think it's really interesting, and not to just say that will never happen here. Why not? Like, let's think about how it could happen and see if we can make it work. But yeah, thank you. Okay, we're at a tricky time. I don't know whether to do the last question or go. We have one question from the chat. Is that the only question, I think? I'm going to maybe go to the question from the chat. It's directly related to what Susan said for our first question. So I'm just going to merge into the Q&A, and I'll go back to the last panel question if necessary. So this is a question from an audience member, and this is the question. To Susan's really helpful and important observations, and this is referring to the first question, I'm wondering if anyone is studying the ways in which the Provost's Fund for hiring Black and Indigenous scholars works. Given there is variation across faculties in terms of the details, example, do the funds go to specific units or do they disappear into central posts? It seems like a great opportunity to use institutional data to understand what works and how it works.
I'm very interested in that question. And I know Vice Provost Heather Boone is looking at that. And I think it connects also once we get into that data of where the positions have been allocated, the retention question I'm really interested in too. How are the folks who have been hired under those positions or those programs proceeding to the things that Suzanne talked about, to tenure, promotion, academic leadership, because that's where all that service workload also is really living in a collegial governance system. And then it would tie back to the things that Susan was talking about around curriculum and her work as Provost Seal Advisor. So I think it's probably pretty soon, but I know that's something that Heather Boone's office is starting to look at now. We've had, I think, 160 hires over of Black and Indigenous scholars over the past 4 or 5 years of the fund. And so now I think looking at that data and thinking about it, that's a really great question and point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Archana. And it seems that that is on people's minds. So it seems that we will definitely, get some of that information in the future. I went off script, so now I'm lost in my notes. But I think what I was supposed to say was, if you have a question you'd like to ask, you can enter it into the Q&A function. So just like for Cynthia's talk, we'll try to get to as many as possible. And you can also use the raise hand feature. And if we call on you, you will be brought off mute so that you can ask your question. I do have another question that has come through. This is from Juanita. There has been a lot of discussion around hiring more Indigenous faculty and staff that I agree is important. However, are we being inclusive? Are we making sure the non-Indigenous hires are asked questions around decolonization and recolonization in their roles? Do you feel it is equally important for everyone to do the work? This comes back to Susan's answer around processes. I'm trying to pull the main theme out of this so we can get some answers. I think what they're asking is, are we making sure when non-Indigenous people are being hired, are they also being included in conversations about decolonization? And are we making sure not only the Indigenous people we're bringing on are thinking of reconciliation and thinking of this work? Are we making sure everyone that we're hiring at U of T? And I think that's kind of a big question that I don't know that we can answer. I think a lot of units are, but I don't know that everyone is. Oh, Suzanne, you're off mute. You want to share?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's a great question. And I think that's more like an aspirational sort of thing. And I think that depends largely on the predilections of chairs of hiring committees. And I think there's a broad range of things that happen in that respect. I quite frankly don't think it's good enough, and I don't think we should have that range. And I think that everyone should be accountable to Black and Indigenous issues who are hired at U of T, and not preface other things which are which take precedence over these issues, which should really be equal with other things that are required.
I agree. Thank you. I think we have time for probably one more question. This is from an anonymous audience member. Do you have any advice for people managers who are looking at developing specific Indigenous focused roles? For example, an Indigenous student support for focused role. How do we do that? Well, I can start things off. I think I think you need to have Indigenous people on your, like if it's a specific Indigenous student support focused role, I would probably connect with a unit that has a role similar to that, such as First Nations House, the Indigenous Student Services. Get someone from that team on your hiring committee. Connect with Indigenous community at U of T in terms of your recruitment of getting someone for that position. I think you could run your job descriptions by people that have similar roles that are Indigenous. I think that is a role that we have quite a few Indigenous positions that have a similar title to that on campus. So I think it would be an easy way to connect with someone who has that position and just make sure you're really connected to community and doing it in a good way, and make sure that person that you're hiring is also connected to the rest of Indigenous U of T and that they're not kind of alone in that role in the unit. But I think that's kind of where I would start with that. Okay, there's a whole bunch of questions that just came through, but we only have 5 minutes left, and we have 0 minutes left for the whole event. We have 5 minutes left. So we are going to, I will welcome anyone to email their questions over, and I'm happy to answer or pass them along if people would like answers. But I'd like to thank you, Susan, Suzanne, and Archana for joining us today. This has been a really great way to hear from 3 different voices and think about ways we can move forward, but also hear some of the things U of T is doing that we can be really proud of. So it was really great to have you come and share with us today. So miigwech. Okay, thank you everyone for being a part of this event. Thank you so much to today's organizers. We could not have planned this event without everyone. I also want to add in a thank you to Campus Events, who just held us all together here and really made sure this ran really smoothly and that we didn't have to worry about very much. So I'm very appreciative for everyone that was involved. I want to thank all the attendees that joined us today. It was really great to have this many people come and join the event virtually. I don't know that we would have got that many people if we were in person. So it was really, really great to have so many people come and join us and engage with the speakers as well. We will be sending a feedback survey out. So keep an eye out for that. It would be greatly appreciated if you could fill that out. I would now like to pass things back over to Andrew. He's going to do a traditional closing for us. Miigwech, Andrew, for being a part of our day today. And this will conclude our event after Andrew's closing. Miigwech.
Just before I say the closing prayer, I just want to say the presentation from Cynthia was so real in regards to the, when he mentioned the survivor and also the ones left behind. I myself went to residential school, 2 of them, and it's so real what she's talking about. And the other thing is, my wife and I did blanket exercise last Sunday. They are people that want to learn. And the last thing I want to say is the healing the memory of the survivors. You can heal the memory, but the anger is always going to be there as a survivor. In order for the anger to go away, you have to find peace. And that peace, you could only find it in your heart. Now, the closing prayer. Creator of all names, we thank you for today. We thank you for Cynthia sharing her academic skills with us. We thank you for the panel that shared their knowledge. We thank you for the people that are present in this room. We acknowledge your love for each of us and always remind us to look after our creation, especially the new ones that are being born this spring. Always to thank for them and also to look after our children. And all this English and ask them, hi, a good day.
Miigwech.